Yeah, Neil, I'm so glad you joined us. Joined me today. Early morning for me right now, a little bit later for you. Um, I'm excited to just hear about from you the stages of movement. I think this is going to be a great conversation to help me to be selfish. I think it's going to help me, but also hopefully others grasp just what God's doing and how He's doing it and the different stages that happens in. But I wondered if you wanted to just start by giving us an intro of yourself, of just a little bit of your call to ministry, call to the Lord, and your interest in movements.
Yeah, thanks, Feeney, and nice to be with you and whoever's listening. And I got into my country in Southeast Asia 4 days ago. I'm in quarantine in a hotel. We hope the internet's going to be good. People bear with us if there are some drags in the audio, but I've served in mission work for close to 28 years. When I was single, I did 2 years in Seoul, Korea. Then I worked in Vietnam 7 years, then worked in South Asia, mainly India, but worked with a lot of teams. Some people y'all know and work with for 7 years. And I worked in Singapore and Malaysia the last about 12 years. And so along the time I got to Vietnam, and we were starting to realize and see a friend in Cambodia next door to me, start to see this movement spring up. And we often say these movements to Christ and of churches, of house churches and different things that later built buildings and became other kinds of churches, began to pop up. And I often say we discovered it a little bit by accident, because we were working in places that we couldn't be the pastors, we couldn't be the people up front. We were working in this Cambodia, Vietnam, China, other countries that had restricted access. And we had to simply train the local people to be the leaders and help encourage them, disciple them, train them to be the leaders. And what happened all of a sudden? Well, we saw 5, 10, 20 churches in some places, and sometimes 180 over in Cambodia in about a 10-year period. A fellow working there. And so I began to realize that, see the thing in India. When I got to the field in 1995, my supervisor sitting me down with several people, the Cambodia guy, the India guy, and saying, you got to hear the story of these people. And what happened was, as we began to empower the disciples with the priesthood of all believers, for them to be the leaders and just helped and encourage them, we could see several churches start at a time, not just one at a time. And as most of history, we see most most missionaries as pastors or teachers, not the people who are always trying to start a number of churches at one time. So we began to find out about movements. I began to be a student of that. When I got to Vietnam, there were about 5 people groups in that country who had had movements to Christ and church planting movements over the past 30, 40 years, and had moved between 0 to 30, and one was about 70% Christian over 30 or 40 years. And there are another 49 people groups in the country who had very few Christians. So we also learned again and kept learning the importance of you got to go to a place, you got to speak the language, or at least get resources in the language, and pay attention to those people groups and very specific places where the gospel had not gone yet. So it's one of my passions, is getting to the harder to reach places, like Paul had said in Romans 15:20. It's always been my ambition to go to where Christ has not been preached, so I don't build on someone else's foundation. And I just love to try to go to those least reached areas. So it's part of my story, 28 years or so doing this kind of work. I became a trainer, began to develop some modules that a lot of people have used, not always mine, often stealing other people's, and then modifying it to make it reproducible, writing a lesson plan that other people could follow. And now some of those lessons have gone to thousands of missionaries and others who find that a helpful content. That's not always my content at all, just sometimes I've developed pieces of a module like this one. I'll tell you the story of this module and how it developed and how several people were involved, but it was so good, other people began to say, hey, I want to teach that to others.
Oh, that's great. Well, that's exactly where I wanted to go. So if you just want to lay out this module, the stages of movement, and I'll put in a word now, I'll link to really anything that Neill references, as well as normally this is just audio podcast, but we're also recording a video. So hopefully we'll be able to share that presentation as well. And I'll put links to that. But yeah, Neill, if you just want to give us the full overview of the stages of movement, that would be great.
Good. We're going to do something unusual. I like to do unusual things and simple things, and we're just going to use my camera instead of sharing a screen. And about 8 or 9 years ago, a friend named Mark S. Kind of developed this document called Phases in the Life of the Historical Church. And it's not that we're going to read this right now, but look at the website Feeney has and download this if you like. But it kind of said that there was an unreached phase, a movement phase, established phase, and an institutional phase. And he talked about what evangelism looks a little different in each phase, and discipleship looks a little different. How the church meets and what they do in those meetings looks different. And then the status of missions, well, there's no missions in those initial phases. We have to send the first missionaries. And then just the bottom one there, status of persecution and the difficulty to be a believer is very different in each of these phases. Often the first phase, there's a lot of persecution, but by the time a movement has been around 10 or 20 years, and later if there's established churches, and a lot of churches later in the life of these churches being started over 10, 30, 50 years of the church is being started somewhere, well, there's not as much persecution because now there's a whole bunch of Christians around, and maybe they're more allowed to be in that culture. So somebody put a bell curve on this. There's another page on this one just talking about kind of a write-up. Another person that I knew put a bell curve on this whole picture and made a this is kind of, a lot of people have, there's a lot of applications people have done, stages of life in an organization. You can find all kind of stuff online. Just look up stages of business, or sometimes it's called an S curve, a bell curve. Often an S curve doesn't start from zero, but I began to draw this picture that kind of put that document in a picture. I like to make things graphic in my modules that I teach so that you get it quick. And if there's a language barrier, you've got something that is cross-cultural and communicates across the cultures. But just to go through it real quick, and we now would say we have 5 phases of church, but I talked about, but many people call it 4 phases. But let's say you had somebody like Jesus or the Apostle Paul, and they go into a new UPG, a new people group, or they go to a new city, a new place. And if there weren't any or many Christians, what are they going to do? Well, they've got to start sharing their faith, and they've got to maybe so broadly, Jesus, so broadly. Jesus himself said, Luke 19:9, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. And so he had a great mission, and he started sharing the gospel. And these dots represent kind of 4 kinds of people. You're going to find 4 kinds of people represented kind of by the colored dots here. And the 4 colors we use represent 4 kinds of people. Some are people you meet that just the color black there represents people who might come sit in the church or might come to your Bible study, but they're never going to really do anything else. They're going to be timid believers, and they're not going to do much. But there might be people represented by the color blue that take leadership one day and who might share Jesus, but it might be harder to become leaders. They're just not going to reproduce very much. Start one church or 2, but maybe one day. But red people, they're not going to come to Christ. You're going to find a whole lot of red people. I should have a whole lot more red dots in most places, right? But finally, you're looking for the green people, the person of peace. And if you can find 1 or more persons of peace, well, you begin to disciple. You disciple everybody, anybody who's willing. The yellow light, yellow light, green light type person we talked about. They're willing to come to Bible study or sit with you. you begin to teach them, disciple them, and you'll take those persons of peace. And I like to draw a tree here because, I try to draw a coffee mug. I don't have one here, I think, in this particular drawing, but you meet in a coffee shop. You meet wherever you can, because in the early stages, who's going to have a building? Nobody has a church. We don't have any buildings. We're going to have to start. I got 1, 2, 3 people, so let's meet in my house. Let's meet anywhere we can. In Africa, it's definitely under trees, and still a lot of churches just under trees. For 200-300 years in the first of church history, there weren't many buildings for churches, and so these first 1 to 300 years, many churches met in homes wherever they could, find a place to meet out by the river, etc. But when we first start, and like the Apostle Paul too, following Jesus, he went to a new place. You had to find the first believers, first persons of peace, and that was hard going. So at the bottom we have that timeline going across the right, and going up would be kind of how many people come to Christ. And we don't know how long it takes. It might take you 3 years to get your first person of peace. It might take you 7. I might not ever get one, but you try and you do what you can to share Christ and find. And if we can start that UPG phase, and I hope a lot of you had this presentation. I'm not going to go into the whole hour-long presentation I like to take on this. We're just going to overview it because hopefully many of you have heard this before. But you can finally get to have some house churches. We just draw kind of a key on the upper left, and you see some little new houses now in the bottom of the picture. And we just have crosses in the house to represent. They become house churches, they become churches, but they're not specialized buildings with later we'll have crosses on top of buildings. And if we're blessed and we can raise up other leaders who take up that mantle and they become apostles, prophets, elders, teachers, shepherds, other giftings of the Spirit start growing in that community, we'll see more churches expand and multiply. And we're going to start finding highly gifted people. So we often call superstar people. And these guys, they can speak well, teach well. As their disciple, they have just a great maybe personality, whatever. And if you start getting superstars, over 5, 10, 15 years of you're doing your work, you're not going to just have house churches or churches under a tree, but hey, okay, some people might start building specialized buildings. You'll see the cross on top of the building. And often you'll see inside that, you got to have a superstar. You got to be a pretty gifted person to grow a church of over 30 or 50 or 70. But hey, a normal Christian, almost any believer could start a Bible study group with 3 or 10 or 20 people in their home if they didn't have to raise all the money and do all the things that are necessary for building a building and doing the upkeep for that building. And often in the countries we're working, we're not allowed to build church buildings. And so it's not that sometimes we're only doing a house church model or simple church models because we're never saying they're better. It's just that's all we can do. And that's it's the better thing to do in that culture. And that if you built a building, it'd be shut down, you'd be stoned, you'd be persecuted more. It's not in some of the places people are listening to this. You're going to open country, and you're open often because you got onto phase 2, which we'd call movement phase, but now actually you're in phase 3 where you have a lot of superstars and a lot of church buildings. And some of those churches are getting quite large. And now in the US and Europe, we have a whole lot of big churches. And over time, if we ever get to this 3rd phase, we not only start getting churches, we start getting institutions represented by that little stick there. That'll be like Bible schools or seminaries. And as you ever got Christians for 10, 20, 30 years, and also you're, by just like that bell curve, Bible knowledge is growing, and you're going to have more qualifications for your leaders because now your churches have been around for a long time. So in phase 2 and 3, later phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, you would have the admonition: don't appoint a new believer as a leader or an elder because he might get prideful. And so you have that. But in the new churches, we often have to work as soon as we can to help people become leaders because that's all we've got. and we need to help them take steps with the knowledge they do have to take up leadership, because they will learn much faster and they will grow much faster if they will take responsibilities instead of just being taught as we're used to being taught, often in a Western context. And in any context, you've been in traditional church, phase 3, we call the formalizing phase, where you start having various models of church, still maybe some small churches, tiny churches, house churches. I was teaching in Cambodia about 9 years ago, teaching this, not this module, but another, but we do have another module facing the brutal facts of church planting. And we asked there, after 10 years, actually at that point, 20 years of modern mission work had been going on, where several movements have taken place. Now that country is maybe 18 or more % Christian. Some statistics say at least 8 or 10. It's hard to know for sure. But we said, how many people in your average church? Well, there were only about 15 to 20 in the average church. But a lot of their churches have had buildings built because that's what they heard they should do. And so then if you formalized a while, we start getting Bible schools. Well, then we go on to have even more. Another phase, we drive in bigger churches, a lot of the churches bigger. And now we have bigger, not just Bible schools, but seminaries. Now we not just have bachelor degrees, but we have even master's and PhD degrees. And we have now, we call this institutional phase, and we would say often we have many titles like president and executive director of a lot of these institutions. You have now denominational leadership and different things happening in these cultures. Why? Because they've been around 40, 50, 60 years. Now, let me ask you a question, Feeney. Which of these phases is bad? Are any of these phases bad?
Ooh, that sounds like a trick question. Man, well, my initial impulse is to think of two things. Is one, of course, for the glory of God, it's bad when we don't have any believers. So the very beginning, but then sometimes you run into the institutions, even thinking of ones that have been past biblical Christianity, moved past it, if you can do such a thing, and they're decaying or dying. So I'm tempted to say number 4, but I'll let you maybe correct me on that.
Well, I definitely like to say none of them are bad, right? They all have people who love Jesus.
Right.
They're just doing their best. They want to bring glory to God. But sometimes they don't realize this is what church looks like in my culture. And I'm in this big church. But, and also nowadays we have a 5th phase. And we call that, I don't really have room here on the screen. I just have drawn it in, excuse me. But we just call that, you see the arrows going up. But often now where Europe and America and other countries that have had churches around for a while find themselves in this phase, and it's now either renew the mission, you could call it renew the vision, renew what we're trying to accomplish, and then we can grow and go up like that green line and continue to grow the kingdom. Or if we don't renew the mission and vision, then we start declining. And we don't use the word die. So this one's called renew the vision or decline. And it takes a long time to decline, right? A church can be around for 30 or 70 years, even though it's lost the vision, and they can still keep meeting, and maybe they keep worshiping and they love Jesus, but slowly they might decline until the last key leaders pass away. And it could take decades for a church to die, even though they're not really keeping their vision and mission. And it can be because they're in a tough place. But anyway, now we have that phase 5. We talk about it. We go into if that's the phase people find themselves, because in that phase, you've got to take every single church sometimes, every single Bible school, and renew that vision and make it active. But okay, let me ask we take this, we teach the 4 or 5 phases. People get it quickly. People usually intuitively get this pretty quick. And we say these arrows down here, what if we take people out of these big churches especially, and people say, I'm called to be a missionary, or I'm called to be a church planter in an unreached place or people group. And they are going back, and they go back to an unreached people group or place, and they're going to start from scratch. And you say, hey, go to a new people group and start a church. But if they came out of those big churches, what kind of church are they going to think about starting?
Yeah, well, we all naturally tend to start what we've seen. So they're going to probably try to start a big type church.
Right. Exactly. People can only do what they know. And so if all you've ever seen is institutional church, you're going to maybe start or think, I'm trying to start churches like that big church. And if you try to do that in most places from the start, especially many of the countries we're sending missionaries now that are restricted access, Muslim or communist and other things, it's not easy to start and even buy the land or build a building. It's not just about restricted access. It's now, if you go to a city that has more than 500,000 people, it costs a lot of money to buy that land and build a building. So you have a high cost to start those churches. And if you wanted to start churches like that, you got to bring all the money and all the leadership in from the outside. And it'll be really hard to raise up local leaders because they'll never see themselves as skilled as the outsiders who are highly trained. So just two more things to mention. We often talk about, there's this blue line, priesthood of the believer. That's not, it's a bell curve too, that goes up for a while, but you see it dropping much faster. And just, we talk about every Protestant denomination believes and talk about believing in priesthood of all believers. Every believer is a child of God, has spiritual giftings. They should be trained and they should be able to use those giftings. And often early in these, when a missionary is new, there's new work in a place, you start these Bible studies, you often see many of the church members, many of the new believers taking up and using their spiritual gifts, sharing their faith more, taking roles in the church. But and then as the movement goes, we often see that happening for a while. And so we often see early in the movements, early in the evangelization, early in the movements, just a really high emphasis on helping every believer know they've got spiritual gifts they should and could use for the glory of God. And that's pretty active. And often we often attribute it to several things. One is the need for that use of those people. Second, often they're persecuted. Often they don't come to Christ as fast as, even as somebody in America, you share Jesus one time, 2 times, they might say, yeah, I believe. Take 15 meetings for a person overseas taking steps toward Christ, because also they know they're going to get hammered if they accept Jesus, and their family and friends are going to ostracize them. And if they do come to Christ, they're going to be persecuted. And they're also, if they do come to Christ, they're more serious believers by the time they do accept Christ. And they're willing to stand up, be counted. And so, yeah, what's God got for me? And so often because of that, just the nature of how you're doing things in the early phases of church, you're really developing those people, discipling them differently than just come to church and sit for a few hours, maybe come to 2 or 3 meetings a week. But really, we don't expect you to do much besides sit here and learn, because then we have a hard time mobilizing most people out of the institutional church, because they say, oh, I'm just a normal person, right? I can't do that stuff. I don't, I'm not a pastor. I'm not a shepherd. I just know I'm supposed to come here and worship God, love God, and live my life. But, no, every believer has special giftings. So anyway, to do a quick overview, we just lay that out, and we say this is very common to movements. If you pray and get to movements, and if you're living in a country that has a lot of Christians, you've had these 4 phases. Charles Wesley and others came to America, went across the Wild West and preached under trees, and they started just preached in little towns for months, years, had raised up leaders, called them have up circuit riders, go around. Sometimes pastor would go 3 or 4 villages a Sunday and lead 3 or 4 groups. And his main job was to raise up other young men who would take up the mantle, and they would try to raise them up as fast as they could to be leaders. And so in USA too, we had these 4 phases at times. And after the Pilgrim times, because they came over and built churches right away in the some of the new countries where the Christians were seeking freedom, but as Christianity, as we populated the West, we had to go to Indians, and slowly people weren't living a Christian life or didn't have churches. And so those were being reestablished. And we saw quite a few movements across America during the 1800s and 1900s as churches started. But now we've seen formalizing, and we've seen institutional churches where it's quite right. You've had churches around for 30 and 150 and 300 years. So it's right. If you got a church of 80 or 300, you want to have that guy that has a master's degree or a doctorate before you're going to let him be your pastor. But we can't expect the guys over here if we're going to start a movement, we have to raise up a lot of leaders by discipling them. And then I just include, a lot of you might include the model, assist, watch, and leave. I talk about training, mentoring, and coaching, but it's all that discipleship process to raise up people to be leaders and start those groups. And we're going to mentor them over time. And then some of them will go to Bible school later. As 20 and 30 years go by, we'll have people who want to start those kinds of things. But they'll be started by insiders instead of outsiders. If we can build the church up for a while, have a movement, and have tens of thousands of believers, we hope, who then need these other types of churches down the road. So, okay, any other place you want to go from there, Feeney?
Oh man, this is great, Neill. Thanks. The question that's really popping into my mind, because we could probably take a question with any of those, but what would you say? And this might be out of your normal context, but I'm thinking about a lot of people that we want to catch a vision for what you just shared of engaging the lost, of every believer being on mission. So thinking about those churches and pastors that are currently in that stage 4, or maybe they see themselves in stage 5, the decline, maybe their challenges or words of encouragement, like what can somebody do that goes, oh, well, we do want to still reach the lost. I still have a passion for that, but I feel stuck here. Like anything you could share there?
Yeah. Love sharing this with pastors and other believers, because they get it and they realize, oh, okay, this explains the world to me a bit more. And what the missionaries are doing, first of all. And I just say we do have those small churches in every phase, because every phase should still be starting new churches, right? And often they start small. Often the goal in an institutional society is to start an institutional type church that has a building, but not always, not anymore. It's expensive, and that's going to take time. So they know they're going to meet in a school or some other place they can meet, but often they have to buy the microphones and have the band and have all those things that we don't do overseas. But the biggest thing for pastors is to say, we're not trying to fight the institutional church when we're overseas doing this different model and doing this different way of starting churches in houses. It's just what we have to do. And one way you can help is just by blessing your missionaries and saying, okay, I get it. You're not going to do church always like we do church. And going to give you some freedom. I was training Koreans. I've trained a lot of Koreans over the years that are missionaries. And when I do this session, it often becomes a counseling session, because in America, we're institutional, but there they have this Confucianism in their culture that highly values the highly educated and the older people. So they just kind of need counseling, because we're there. They just, the first time I did it, they just said, oh, brother, we're ultra institutional. We can't do anything without the blessing of our pastor. And our pastors are often telling us what to do, but they don't understand that our lives and work don't look the same as their life. They're expecting, how many buildings have we built? And it's like, well, first you want to let the insiders build those buildings, right? Not raise all that money from the other countries to raise the money. And some people do that, but we're just saying we need to raise up the believers first, have small groups, and then slowly some will go on to build buildings and eventually have Bible schools. But some people think, and then we have a lot of Koreans, a lot of Americans who go overseas, and the first thing they do is start a Bible school. And that's kind of okay, but that's a very long-term approach. It's going to take you years to raise up and graduate people who can then pastor one church. if you're not trying to do this, let's start a lot of churches first and then slowly educate people and give them more and more training over time. And yes, eventually they'll need Bible schools, but let's not maybe do that first. Otherwise, we can only start as many churches as we graduate people from a Bible school. So yeah, just getting this picture and getting the concept that these four phases exist. And I'll just say one more thing too, is what's the missionary's role? The missionary has to learn to move between these five phases, because you're meeting people who are in these phases, and you've got to kind of cast vision differently and talk to people differently because they're in that phase. And you're trying to help them picture what you're doing and how you're doing it and why it's a good thing, when sometimes they're just thinking, well, that's not the way we do things. So they're trying to tell you that's not the way you do things. You need to do it this way. It's like, well, no, not in a UPG or a unreached place where you have to often start from scratch. And so, yeah, thanks.
That's good. And I'm noticing that blue line. I think as you said, any Protestant denomination would want to see their believers and better embrace the priesthood of the believer. So I feel like there's a call. This is just a comment. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, but a call for whatever stage or phase you find yourself in to raise that blue line up the whole way. That the priesthood of the believer would be elevated no matter where you find yourself.
You got it.
Looking at stories of churches in that institutional phase, probably, that still have a huge burden for the lost, both at home around them and abroad. And I feel like this is just a great picture of what the reality is. And if we know what reality is, we're better able to influence. So I really appreciate that. What can we do to make sure we keep the priesthood of the believer high, as a high value, no matter where we're at?
Yeah, one of my favorite modules that I stole from a guy named Bruce was about, he had a great Bible study on priesthood of all believers, and I modified that. And we're a holy priesthood, a royal holy priesthood. I'm gonna always mess the three up, right? But we're a chosen people, royal priesthood, holy nation, right? Okay, sorry. But anyway, getting all those words together. And so just helping people understand that, and I love to teach that and say, God has special giftings for you. And he gave some gifts. We talk about the APEST gifts: apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. We just say, I call that apostolic gift was those who were sent out. The sent out ones is the actual meaning of apostle. I think also it represents what some missionaries become, and that's a person who starts multiple churches. And to start multiple churches, the thing you need is people using those spiritual gifts. And you're then enabling them, and you're doing your work differently, where you're now a people builder, that discipler, a good friend who helped make some elements of that picture. He just says, we always have people say, and you'll see this in almost every culture, you'll say, well, hey, why don't you kind of lead the prayer time next week in our Bible study? And somebody will say, well, oh, no, not me. I don't know how to do that. And he just teaches everybody to answer within their movement, yes, you can, and I'll help you. And so, yes, you can. Everybody says, oh, not me. I'm just a simple person. I'm just a regular Christian. I'm not a pastor type guy. I'm not a teacher. Well, yeah, maybe not. But hey, you can do some small things. Start giving people small roles, having do some things in your worship service. In a small context, hey, you lead the Bible study next week. And, now, after a number of weeks and months, they know how the Bible study's led. We're going to do it a certain way, and so they can do that. And so you just start giving them small jobs and later big jobs. Hey, you invite them, hey, come along with me, we're going to go, you got any friends or family we'd like to visit? And hey, let's go to the coffee shop and share Jesus with people. And you start trying to take them along, sharing the faith, looking for other green light people, other persons of peace. Start just spending time with them. And then just again, I use that word training. And training doesn't have to be a special set aside classroom. It happens in our church every week. You're doing a lot of teaching and discipleship, but then you need to mentor. And mentoring, I just define simply as doing things with people. So take them out to share their faith, go meet them at a coffee shop, have them sit in while you're discipling somebody else. Let them see you do it. Don't just talk about you go do it. No, watch me do it first. And then we have model assist, watch and leave as part of that mentoring process. Then we can coach you for years to come, help you grow. But most people need those several steps in order to start realizing what they have in Christ and how to become a useful priest, even though that sounds weird to say, right?
Yeah, that's good. I think if we could get every leader in any capacity to say, yes, you can, and I'll help you, that would be a huge win. So that's a great word. Yeah, Neill, I'd just love to kind of give you the last word and see if there's any final challenge or encouragement you'd want to give anybody that's listening.
Yeah, I just applaud anybody out there trying to share their faith, trying to give gifts, and especially if you're trying to start a new Bible home that'll become a church. We just love to see these people doing new things and reaching out to lost people, being like Jesus, going out to reach that which was lost. And so, yeah, keep it up. It's not easy. I know you hear about movements and we draw that nice little picture and it makes it sound easy, but we know it's not easy. We know you reach messy people and they've got to be discipled out of the garbage and the brokenness they're in. And so it takes a lot of work to do that. So just keep at it. And I just told Feeney one of the things I talked about is we talk about movements and you'll hear stories. Somebody started 100 churches, somebody started 1,000 churches. No, one person starts one church or maybe 5, 3, a few start 10 or 16, but they do it with the help of others. And they begin to help others use their spiritual giftings. And then they become a network of churches and elders, and they start cooperating together to have a network of churches. And that's what those movements are made up. A lot of people exercising. There might be a person who was the apostolic starter of that, or kind of the strategy coordinator. We talked about the different levels of leadership, but we need all those people doing their roles and using their gifts. So stick with it. It's not easy. It might take you years to get those first persons apiece, but we just believe they're out there. And I appreciate anybody doing this kind of work. So great to be with you, Feeney, and everybody out there.